Chapter 7, Lesson 3, The Southern Economy. What to know? How did people in the southern colonies use natural resources to earn a living? Understand how geography affected the economy of the southern colonies. Identify the major industries in the southern colonies. Explain how the southern economy depended on slavery. Vocabulary: indigo, indigo, interdependence, interdependence, broker, broker. People: Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Places: Charlestown, Baltimore, Wilmington, Wilmington. You are there. It's so hot that your shirt sticks to your back. You and several other workers are loading hundreds of barrels of rice onto a ship in Charlestown, South Carolina. The huge ship arrived from England 2 days ago. Its tall mast cast shadow across the entire dock. You stop for a moment to look up at the ship's sails. As you wipe the sweat from your forehead, you wish you were out at sea instead of stuck on this dock. Charlestown, South Carolina, became the largest city in the southern colonies. Children in history. Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Eliza Lucas Pinckney moved to South Carolina with her parents in 1738. When she was 16 years old, her father had to return to the West Indies. Eliza started experimenting with indigo seeds her father had sent her. She worked so hard that she wrote, "I hardly allow myself time to sleep or eat." After 3 years, Eliza was able to grow an indigo plant that produced an excellent dye. She gave some of her seeds to neighbors and friends. Within a few years, South Carolina planters were selling 1 million pounds of indigo a year to cloth makers in Europe. Why is it important to work hard at whatever task you have? Okay, so our first section on the left side of your notes, cash crops. Port cities like Charlestown were important to the economies of all the southern colonies. Plantations produced tons of cash crops each year, and those crops needed to be shipped to markets in England and the West Indies to be sold. Plantations in different colonies grew different crops. Okay, so cash crops. Port cities like Charlestown were important to the economies of all the southern colonies. Plantations produced tons of cash crops each year, and those crops needed to be shipped to markets in England and the West Indies to be sold. Plantations in different colonies grew different crops. In Maryland, Virginia, and northern North Carolina, tobacco was still the main cash crop. Growing tobacco required many workers and a lot of land. After about 7 years, tobacco plants would use up all the nutrients in the soil. This meant that in order to grow more tobacco, farmers had to clear more land. Tobacco plantations were not as successful farther south. In southern North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, tobacco plantations were not as successful further south in southern North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The climate there was too warm and wet for tobacco to grow well. With the labor of their slaves, many plantation owners and small farm owners began growing rice. In fact, rice became such an important cash crop in South Carolina that it was often called Carolina gold. On drier land, rice did not grow well. Here, landowners found they could grow indigo plants. From these plants, they made indigo, which is a blue dye that was used in the cloth-making process. Indigo became an important cash crop after Eliza Lucas Pinckney experimented with the plant. Using seeds from the Caribbean, Pinckney spent several years growing different kinds of indigo. By the 1740s, planters across South Carolina had started growing indigo too. So what were the cash crops in the southern colonies? Our next section, the economy grows. That'll be on the left side of your 2-column notes. How did the relative location of Charlestown affect its growth? Why did the economy grow? How did the economy grow in the southern colonies? The economy grows. Let's read. Plantations were the most important part of the economy in the southern colonies. Planters owned much of the best land and most of the slaves. They also produced nearly all of the region's cash crops. Although plantations were self-sufficient, their economies depended on others. Depending on others for goods and services is called interdependence. Owners of large plantations needed people to sell their crops. Most often, a broker did this. A broker is a person who is paid to buy and sell for someone else. Planters sent their crops to England or the West Indies together with a list of things they wanted the broker to buy for them. The broker sold the crops overseas, bought what the planter wanted, and sent the goods back to the colonies. As plantations grew larger and more productive, traders and merchants in the southern port towns grew richer from exporting more cash crops. By the mid-1700s, some settlements along the southern Atlantic coast, such as Norfolk and Savannah, had grown into large towns and cities. And we'll go back to this in a second. When ships carrying goods from England arrived, imported tea, coffee, furniture, and silverware were sold to planters and to people in the cities. Then the ships sailed back to England loaded with tobacco, rice, and indigo. Relative location affected the success of both plantations and cities. The most successful plantations were often located near ports or deep rivers. Their location made it easier for ship crops to England and other markets. Likewise, cities located near rivers did well. Charlestown, South Carolina, was built at the point where the Ashley and Cooper rivers join and empty into a deep harbor. An early visitor to Charlestown wrote that the great number of ships would soon make it a busy town. He was right. By the 1740s, ships sailing from Charleston carried about 30 million pounds of rice to England every year. Baltimore, Maryland, was founded in 1729 on the Patapsco River, which flows into Chesapeake Bay. Baltimore prospered as the busy port exported increasing amounts of grain and tobacco produced in Maryland. As the demand for new ships grew, Baltimore also became a major center for shipbuilding. How did the relative location of Charlestown affect its growth? Okay, let's look at our text features. A closer look. Rice from farm to market. An enormous amount of labor was required to start a rice plantation. Most rice plantations were set up along tidal rivers and swamps. Slaves drained, cleared, and leveled swamps. After rice was planted, fields were flooded several times during the growing season. This helped the rice grow. When the water was drained from the field, workers tended to the plants. workers harvested the rice. They threshed or separated the rice grains from the plant. When the rice was ready for market, brokers agreed to take the rice to England. In England, a broker traded the rice for English goods. And who do you think played the most important role in getting the rice to market? Okay, our next section, other industries. Other industries. Although agriculture and trade were the most important parts of the Southern colonies' economy, the region did have other industries, like farming. Nearly all of these industries were based on the region's natural resources. Thousands of deer, beavers, and other animals lived in the forest of the southern colonies. At first, the colonists traded with American Indians for furs to sell in Europe. Later, many settlers in the backcountry made a living as hunters and trappers. These settlers often lived beyond areas already settled by other colonists. They were also used to cooperating with the American Indians for profit. The region's forests were important natural resources too. The port city of Wilmington, North Carolina, became an important shipping center for forest products because of its location on the Cape Fear River. Wilmington was founded in the 1720s after colonists from South Carolina began moving north. They were looking for fertile soil to start new plantations. Instead, they found lots of trees. They brought in workers to cut down the trees and to build sawmills. We had a grist mill before for grain, now we have a sawmill for lumber. Colonists also found the trees useful for making naval stores. Southern pine trees provided tar, turpentine, and pitch needed to waterproof the wood and rope on ships. One colonial governor said in 1734, "There is more pitch and tar made in the two Carolinas than in all the other provinces on the continent." Most of these naval stores were sent to England from southern port cities such as Wilmington. However, some were kept for use in the southern colonies. Baltimore's location near the Chesapeake Bay helped it become a busy port city. Shipbuilding became a large industry in the colonies. In the late 1700s, Baltimore, Maryland's shipyards became well known for improving the way ships were built. Shipbuilders developed the Baltimore Clipper. It was one of the world's fastest sailing ships. So what were the other industries of the Southern economy based on? In summary, the Southern colonies had an interdependent economy. Enslaved Africans and other workers produced cash crops, furs, lumber, and naval stores. Then merchants and traders in port cities shipped these goods to England and to other colonies. Southern colony trappers and hunters often had to travel long distances. And questions for review and group discussion. How did people in the southern colonies use natural resources to earn a living? What clues can you use to remember the meaning of the term interdependence? What were the busiest port cities in the southern colonies? How do their locations help explain their growth? Give one example of a primary source in this lesson. How do you know it is a primary source? How did the location of a farm in the southern colonies affect the kind of crops that were grown? And let's look at this map that has the different resources, colonial products that were made. It's color-coded by New England colonies, middle colonies, and southern colonies. Take some time to study this map and identify where the cattle, corn, wheat, fish, furs, indigo, iron, lumber, naval stores, rice, tobacco, and whale products come from.